So, hey, Ilya, how are you doing? You're up in, I think, Toronto. Is that right?
For the moment, yes.
For the for the moment, what does that mean?
I live in Montreal, but I have some family in Toronto as well.
I see. Oh, you're visiting your mother. Is that right?
This is correct.
Yeah. Well, I know Montreal pretty well. Toronto, much less so. Um, but Montreal certainly is a fantastic city. I have a very, very dear friend up there. So, now tell me your journey to Canada has been rather, what's the word, circumtuitous. You you made it to Canada originally starting out in, is it Moscow, and then to Israel, and then Canada?
This is correct. But uh, as cir circuitous as it may seem, it's actually somewhat typical for a great many people of my background and age, because when we left Moscow for Israel in '91, we did so in the company of about 1 million people, many of whom later on ended up coming to North America to study and to live a little bit later.
And when did you finally settle in Canada then?
In 1994, we came in the spring, just almost exactly 28 years ago.
Okay, yeah, that's a long time ago. So, and is the plan now after Montreal then to head to New York to get better bagels there? Is that what your plan
I'm
is?
not sure that you can get better bagels than you have in Montreal. I think
I don't know.
sorry, New York has nothing on our bagel scene, to be
So you
honest.
say.
Well, I lived in New Haven for about 10 years, and New York was not far away. So
Mhm.
I suppose I have some authority, but of course, I don't want to offend anyone or anything.
Okay, well, tell me, so do you come from a musical family? So you play piano and also harpsichord and forte piano and organ, I believe. Uh, and
Yeah,
and I think you're married to a forte piano player. Is that correct?
absolutely. All of this is 100% correct.
So what's your background? Are your parents or were they musicians also, or
Not at all. My parents are both engineers, but I have some uh, grandparents who made certain contributions in the field of humanities. One of my grandfathers was a literary scholar and a researcher, and the other one wrote quite a few books, but not necessarily all had to do with les belles lettres. Some of them were about science and technology and things like this, but
so
uh,
commentator kind of thing?
yeah, but my family was always very musical, and they always loved music, loved the arts, and went to concerts, theaters, all just sort of normal Soviet intelligentsia kind of activity.
Okay, so you speak, I guess, Russian and Hebrew and English and probably French if you're in Montreal.
French not very well, but my Italian is not too bad because I spent a lot of time there, and Romanian is also not bad because I hear it at home all the time, um, and one semester of Japanese.
Wait, why do you hear Romanian at home?
Because my wife is Romanian,
Ah,
and she speaks Romanian to our children, and I speak Russian to them. So it's a my older son speaks 4 languages equally well.
wow, she's
Yeah.
okay. And I guess the Romanian and Italian, the grammar is different, but the language is comprehensible between those two also, as I recall.
Yeah, it's exactly in the middle. It's between Latin and Slavic in terms of vocabulary and grammar. it's a real, how to say, a hybrid between these two worlds.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No wonder the grammar is complicated then, right?
To an extent, yeah. Some of it is counterintuitive, except if you are from Bulgaria, for instance, because they put articles at the end of the word rather than at the beginning.
Oh,
It's the only Latin language that does that, and that comes from, if we're talking linguistics, from the Slavic Sprachbund. You know, the Bulgarians have that also, but Russians don't, and other Slavic countries don't. Yeah.
well, what I remember from Bulgarians is that this means yes, right? And this means no in Bulgarian,
Yeah,
which is
that's true.
totally confusing, actually.
There are many things that are confusing. There are fewer gestures and sounds and vowels and consonants than words and meanings. So in every language, in every culture, you're bound to get something that sounds just like something else in another culture, or means exactly the opposite or exactly the same.
Sure.
And sometimes it's just like that. There's no reason to it.
Well, you've had such an itinerant past. How do you, Americans are always asking this question, but how do you identify yourself? What do you think of as home, or your kind of home culture, or maybe it's just the world, actually?
My home is music.
Mm-hmm.
And in my musical journey, I owe thanks to primarily to three people. One of them was my piano professor here in Canada, Marietta Orlov, who, despite her Russian surname, was actually Romanian also.
Oh.
And she was a student of the lady who taught Dinu Lipati, Florica Muzicescu, who was a very, very important piano pedagogue. She also was, for a short while, a teacher of Radu Lupu and a number of other people. And if I know,
left, I suppose.
say what? Sorry.
Before she left Romania, then.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. And if there's anything that I know about piano playing and music making, I learned from her. She was for many years the preeminent piano pedagogue in Canada, and a person of tremendous refinement, intelligence, musical instinct, pianistic expertise, which is very, very different from, so to speak, Russian tradition, whatever that means, because that's actually many, many different things. So if there's any foundational background in terms of piano playing, I think it more comes from her, from this sort of rather more Central European tradition than Slavic. I owe a lot to my wonderful, basically my only harpsichord teacher, Colin Tilney, who, especially in the 70s and 80s, was a renowned presence on the early music scene, and who celebrated his 90th birthday last year, and who basically took me into the world of early music in a way that many other people probably would not have been able to. Very inspiring person. And I owe a great deal of thanks to Boris Berman, who was my professor during my time at Yale, who I resemble in many aspects in terms of our musical interests, and I think perhaps also to a certain extent personality, and who taught me a great deal, as much through his teaching as by personal example, and just a kind of osmosis that I am very grateful for.
When you say personal example, do you mean like a, kind of moral example, like, Pablo Casals, or just in terms of work ethic, or
all of these? I've always had tremendous admiration and respect for Professor Berman, because he's one of these rare people who, especially among people coming from a certain part of the world, never felt that they know everything and they are absolutely the best because they graduated from Moscow Conservatory. He always felt that the musical world is much richer and wider than what he was exposed to when he was there. And he always keeps an open mind. He's an extremely hard worker, somebody who is very principled in the way that he, and humble in the way that he approaches interpretation and performance, and somebody who, for all these reasons, I have tremendous respect for.
So how did that affect you when you were working with him? And, you know, I think of some teachers, really old school, talking about Central European. As I recall, Bartok used to teach by, he would play the piece and then he would have the student kind of imitate him. And, you know, in this way, you would, in a wonderful way, you would develop these senses of national schools of approaching music. But the danger is also, you're saying, well, you know, here's my way, just do it like my way. And then in a couple of years, when you graduate, you'll find your own way, which works for some people, but doesn't work for others. And then there's some people who are like, you know, well, everyone has to have their own, you know, from a very early age, just find your own path. I mean, you know, of course, there are all many different approaches, but how did Mr. Berman teach music and interpretation?
Well, you know, I was lucky that with him and with Marietta Orlov and with Colin Tilney, as a matter of fact, I was lucky in that I had teachers who never imposed their vision on me in any forceful way. I always felt respected and supported, and even when I would go totally off the deep end into the wrong world of mistakes and disasters, it was never in the spirit of "I told you so." So for that, I'm also quite grateful. I think that actually I learned the most from Mr. Berman when we would play together, which happened already after I graduated. And then I saw firsthand his work ethic and his meticulousness, and his very practical, but at the same time very wise approach and way of planning his work, and respect and know-how of the instrument, which is extremely valuable.
Just when you're playing piano four hands, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we played for instance, the Rite of Spring, we played even Carnegie Hall. And I was very young then, and I felt very grateful that he would trust me with something like this, and would guide me in a very patient way. There's certain things that I couldn't do, and respect when I had the solution that was very different from his. And it was great. It was a very meaningful interaction, and we keep in touch to this day.
I mean, I always think that for any piece of music, there are many right ways to do it, but at the same time, there are wrong ways as well. It's
Totally.
not free for all, of course, but there isn't any one interpretation that is the interpretation, right? So,
I mean, yes, I suppose that's true. Although some people have I think, made such an indelible stamp in certain areas or with certain pieces that, of course, you could always think that it could be better, but I invite everyone to try, and it would be fun to see them fail. For instance, I doubt if anybody ever is going to record the Enescu third piano sonata better than Dinu Lipati. Probably it's possible, but I'm not sure because it's just it's such a complete and such a stratospherically sophisticated performance that is so in tune on the deepest level with what the composer wanted, and so precise and free at the same time. I invite anybody to play Rachmaninoff's transcriptions better than him.
How does that apply then? I mean, I know you recorded the Enescu violin sonatas, right? And
yes,
and of course, there's, I think, an iconic recording of Enescu playing it, right?
Yeah.
So how, I mean, if you were to be asked to record, some of these pieces that Dinu Lipati has recorded that you think are iconic, how would you approach that then if you had to record those?
Well, if we're talking about the piano and violin works, and here one has to say that, first of all, this is just my opinion, but there is some factual truth to it. When Enescu was recording these pieces, he was already not in top form. He had a lot of health problems, and he had damage to his hearing. He had a spine condition. He couldn't really play the way he used to play when he was in his prime. Mm-hmm. So these recordings from that point of view are a little bit compromised. And then in terms of temperament,
solo piano music. I mean, if you were
solo piano music, I thought you were talking about piano and violin.
Well, I mentioned those, but I mean, you had mentioned some of the just because I know you recorded those, quite a beautiful recording. But if you were asked to record solo piano music, for instance, some of these Dinu Lipati recordings that you think are unsurpassable, then how would you approach that then?
Well, I mean, the sly answer would be I would try to record what he didn't, which is, for example, the first sonata, which I have a recording that's floating around. But a more honest one would be that I would try to, as one always does, to try to, first of all, respect the score and the spirit of what the composer puts down on paper, and try to do your best. I'm not saying that there's one way to do it and that's it. It's just with certain pieces, it's hard to. There are certain little monuments of performing art which one just has to say, okay, this is really quite inimitable. And of course things cannot stay still. If we would just say, okay, this is the best, nobody should try it again, the art would die. But it's also good to kind of just take stock and say, hey, you know what, this is kind of pretty damn awesome.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think of, for instance, you listen to Borodin Quartet, the old Borodin Quartet, recording Shostakovich quartets and working with Shostakovich, and it's such an iconic sound that they're making. And I can imagine someone saying, well, these are Russians, they really feel the work, they really understand the work. This is how one should play it, as opposed to maybe an American group, which might have a different approach. Or you think of French music, Americans playing French music and might tend to have a bit more muscular sound. Is there a right way to play Ravel and Debussy or a wrong way, or national interpretations, or can only French people play French music, really understand it, or only Americans could play Copland? I don't think so, but at the same time, there are national schools which fit with composers too, right?
Yeah, I am a great believer in stylishness. I distrust very much the idea of national school, because in every nation there are individuals who are, if they're talented, they're not like somebody else. So, for instance, in Cortot doesn't sound like Marguerite Long, thankfully, or Samson Francois does not sound like I don't know, Monique Ass, or Ksetsu. The same, in Russia, Rachmaninoff does not sound like Gilels or Richter or Feinberg, or whoever you choose. But there is of course, there is, such a thing as style, and there is a certain sense of sound and appropriateness of gesture and inflection and all this, which comes from the language of the composer, what the playing manner was at the time, and within that there are so many possibilities. And sometimes when something is completely unidiomatic, it could be wonderfully wrong, but still very compelling.
Sure.
Yeah. And sometimes people hate the result, and sometimes people love the result, and sometimes it's an improvement on what was there.
Mm-hmm.
And some music actually is not so important to be very stylish, because it's a little bit less, dare I say, specific in this regard. And in others where you have to really present the full gamut of flavors in order to make the music speak. For instance, French Baroque music for decades and decades and decades was, if we talk about the 20th century, was the poor cousin of Bach German Baroque, which was much more in the public eye, because people didn't have a sense of what would be the right performance practice. And without the performance practice, the music sounded square, wooden, and basically like drivel, until people like William Christie and many other exponents of French Baroque music, who, this last 40 years, have introduced into the mainstream a very specific vocabulary of techniques and approaches that you have to put into the music in order for it to speak. And then suddenly you realize, wow, this is a very different kind of expressive world, completely distinct from German music. Mm-hmm. But if you don't bring these things to the table, then the music basically dies.
Well, it's interesting also that the times change too. There's a recording, wonderful recording, I don't listen to too often, but it's of the Mozart Symphonia Concertante with Lionel Tertis on viola, and I think it might be Albert Salmons on violin.
Yes.
It builds and builds and builds, and then they come in and then just slow it down, about 20 clicks on the metronome, and they're slurping and sliding, and they're sitting on notes for a long time and then moving. And you can't imagine a more hyper romantic recording of Mozart. And it sounds kind of funny today, but it's also, as wrong as it seems, it's also beautiful in its own way.
Absolutely. I adore, for instance, Ionesco's recordings of Bach, even though they're also a little compromised because of his issues with his hearing, or his little excerpt of him playing Mozart violin concerto, which is ravishingly beautiful, because the performer had genius and imagination and feeling and reached for something very, very deep. Or when, for instance, he and Menuhin played together the Bach double concerto, it's unbelievably moving.
Oh, look that up. I haven't heard that. So, well, you seem particularly well situated to look at this, just given your cosmopolitan background. Russia, Israel, Italy, Romania, and North America, and Yale. You've certainly, you're able to hear many different kind of, if we can call them somewhat, schools or approaches to music, and and see what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, to me, music is a language. And like with languages, there are many of them, and there are dialects and accents and ways of speaking, which, if you are in tune with these things, immediately put you in touch with where this is coming from, and context and flavor and all that. And if you hear English spoken a certain way, you would recognize immediately where that person is coming from, and you'll have all kinds of associations. And if you hear, I don't know, Dickens read with a thick Russian accent, it would probably be hilarious, but also you would realize it's kind of wrong.
Sure. Although
So I like
great actor, a great Russian actor speaking it with the Russian accent would, would be as moving as hearing it with, a high English accent.
I don't know. When silent film ended and the talkies appeared in the late 20s, early 30s, all the great silent Russian movie actors who were in exile, working for French and German studios and even Hollywood, were all out of a job, because suddenly their voices were heard. And of course, the French people go blah, 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 and they would speak very slowly and like this, and it didn't work. This is just to say that I think it's important to get these things right, but right doesn't mean that this is the only right. It's just that it's something that's I personally care about a lot. For instance, not to ruffle any feathers, but when I hear Richter play Schubert, it sounds to me like he's playing it on a white piano put in the middle of a set for Odyssey 2001. Because not for 1 second I feel or hear Vienna, the lilt and the charm and the urbanity of this music, which is the surface, because underneath, of course, it's much, much deeper. But without it, I think it loses its sense of context, and then the tension between the surface and the depth is a little lost. But there are people who adore how he plays Schubert and everything, and that's fine. But to me, when I hear Schnabel play Schubert, I know that he speaks the language perfectly. And you could say, well, I like this more or I like this less, but it's the idiom.
Well, you mentioned silent films. So you've got this whole other arrow in your quiver of, first of all, period music and improvising, which is unusual for most classically trained musicians. And also you play for silent films, right? I believe.
That's right. Yes.
So how did this start, and what are some of your experiences there? That must be phenomenal, I would think.
Well, it's something that I enjoy a great deal. I started out actually as a composer, and I majored my first year in undergraduate. I did a double major, but then I realized, there's a lot of bad music that is written. There's no need to add to it. But what I discovered I could do quite a few years later is that I could easily adapt and use my instrument in a very idiomatic way, or instruments, to connect with the emotional world and the emotional and historical and cultural and atmospheric dimensions of the images that are put in front of me. And of course, silent film is a very bizarre thing because it was never, in fact, silent from the very, very beginning, from the very first days of, the brothers Lumiere showing
Train, right?
Train, right, exactly, and the garden hose and all this. There was some kind of musical accompaniment, and so what I find particularly stimulating and also as a listener, if I'm in the audience and somebody else is doing it, quite moving, is the combination of live, spontaneous response to what is happening on the screen, which is unique because in any other film experience, everything is recorded already. But here there's an element of the moment. You experience the moment in a very different way. And you get the chance to shape and to direct the viewer's attention to create and enhance and support the sense of narrative, a sense of drama, a sense of energetic arcs, which the dramatic ebb and flow of what's happening in the film. And without that, actually, sometimes it's quite hard to relate on an emotional level to, if you ever sat in front of a totally silent screen, I guarantee you tune out in 10 minutes because something critical is missing. And if you respect the film and if you respect what you're being shown, you can not only make that very vivid for the viewer, but also in a subtle way provide your own opinion, your own subtle interpretation of what exactly is happening, the subtext. Sometimes there are dances and people hopping around on the screen, but maybe sometimes there's a reason to play sad and slow music to that, and that gives us some idea of what is actually happening in the film on a different dimension. And vice versa. Sometimes it looks tragic, but actually is not really tragic. And if you are emotionally sensitive, you would probably highlight that in the way that you accompany, rather than just Mickey Mouse everything and play a funeral march when there's a funeral. And I mean, of course, sometimes you have to do that too, but there is another level to all this.
So, I mean, what's the average length of a silent film, and how do you prepare when you've accompanied a film? I mean, I assume you watch the movie many times, so you have a sense of it, probably.
Oh yeah. If I want to do a good job, I will study the film endlessly. I will watch it many times, actually without sound, to force myself either playing for it or just watching it, or sometimes putting it at the higher speed, so that you just like if you practice very slow music, if you play it a little faster, you see a little bit clearer what the shape of the work is. Same here. This way you can understand a bit how the bigger chunks connect. But you watch again and again, and you notice, you look for clues and details, and a sense of what belongs to what, and the structure of the film. Where is a comma? Where is a caesura? Where is a moment of rest? Where does one accumulation of intensity end and another begins, and things like this. And as far as the length is concerned, well, that varies a great deal. There are some, early films which are just a few seconds long, but then there are also films like Intolerance or The Birth of a Nation of Griffith, which go on for hours and hours and hours. I think the uncut version of Birth of a Nation is something like 3-4 hours. Intolerance is about 4 hours. Yeah, this is the Nibelungen of this is endless.
More ways than one, I suppose, actually.
Yeah. So it's a challenge for the listener and for the performer, for the audience. You need to have stamina.
Yeah.
If you play for something like this, and you need to have a very firm sense of structure and pace, because you can exhaust yourself very easily and quickly if you don't breathe with what's happening on the screen. And if it's a really good film, and if it's well edited, and if there is a deep sense of pulse to it, which it should have, then I notice when you play, you don't notice the passage of time, because it just takes you, and you don't realize that half an hour, an hour and a half has passed. But you realize very quickly, if you get off that wonderful wave, that you're floundering behind, and then everything becomes a drag, and you just want somebody to take this off your hands for like 10 minutes. But it's not possible.
Well, it's interesting, this idea of improvisation, because I mean, I associate improvisation with either jazz, of course. You might have a jazz quartet, like modern jazz quartet or Oscar Peterson or something, and the players are kind of responding to each other. They'll all have a solo. Or I think of improvisation in Baroque music, where the music is written out, or certainly you're doing a figured bass and you're kind of figuring out something over structure. And generally you have someone else you're playing with, I would think. But your role as an improviser with a film, you're relating to very specifically a story, you're painting, you're giving a kind of oral interpretation of what the director has done on the screen, or your psychological interpretation of that. And you're on your own for, again, 15 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours, or 3.5 hours. It's kind of improvisation by an order of magnitude, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm a firm believer, first of all, that a performer should always have a first-person relationship to their instrument. We are always trained from a very young age as pianists. We play music by others, and these others had different instruments and different bodies and different ears and different ways of handling the keyboard. And I suppose it's, on one end, this is good because you become like a chameleon. You play Beethoven with a different sound, and you play Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and so on. But I really believe that we also need to have our own feeling for the instrument. And this is where, when I improvise personally, I feel that I have my own piano dialect or harpsichord dialect, consisting of patterns and gestures and sonorities and colors and ways of handling the keyboard that I discovered myself, which is unfiltered through the lens of interpreting somebody else's music. And so that, I think, is very important, even when you go from improvising to performing. You bring that feeling of first-person authority, because you realize that the people who wrote this wonderful music, they had that too, and it's embedded in their works. And I also always had personally a little bit of a problem with playing in a kind of a very passive way scores which in many cases clearly need some contribution. I mean, easy case in point, if you play Mozart concerti, if you don't improvise in the slow movements, you're not doing your job. If you don't fill in the fermatas, you're not doing your job, because they would have been filled in. That's what the audience was waiting for you to improvise a transition, to make a cadenza, to make a beautiful vocal ornament, not to do the same thing on repeat. I think, to my mind, all music begins with some improvisatory impulse. I think that, and if you look at world music, there are relatively few traditions where things are as fixed as in ours. That this is how it is, and there's no other way, because absolutely every note has to be in place and it cannot be changed. And of course, there are some pieces which are so perfect you don't want to change anything. I don't want to add anything to the Hammerklavier sonata, you know, or but for me, it's important that even in pieces which don't require any actual improvisation, that you approach it with that frame of mind. So that the audience and you experience it as if it's happening for the first time. And what, in terms of practice and all this, what obviously allowed me to feel at ease with this is that I played a lot of continuo when I was working as an early musician. You know, playing also a lot of early 17th century repertoire, which has often very few indications of what you should play, very few indications of figured bass, not nearly as specific as what happens later. So you have to really improvise and have a sense of authority at the keyboard, and at the same time not interfere with what the vocal part is doing and the instrumental part is doing. So all these things.
You mentioned world music. Is there, do you listen to world music or non-classical at all? And if so, what do you listen to? What do you put on when you're not putting on classical music?
I think I'm probably quite ignorant about many phenomenal musical currents and traditions that would be a great source of nourishment. I like a lot earlier jazz music from the teens, 20s, and 30s, pre-war jazz. I like a lot folk music from Eastern Europe, especially Romanian folk music, because I'm not Romanian, but it speaks to me, and it's actually Romania is one of the few countries in Europe where this tradition is still really alive. People sing, people dance. Most people know a certain kind of shared repertoire, which is very important, I think, for one's well-being. And there is a whole repertoire of Russian, Soviet, whatever music that is not really pop, but it's also not really classical. It's what I used to hear when I was growing up. Often there's good poetry, and it's a certain way of communicating between people, which I appreciate very much. So my son sings all these songs. Some of them are just for kids, and some of them are not really for kids at all.
But I think it's incredibly important. I came up recently, I was in a thrift store, and I came across a book which just stopped me in my tracks, because it was a book of melodies that when I had been in first grade, second grade, and 6 years old, 7 years old, we learned all these folk songs, and we used to sing them. She'll be coming around the mountain when she comes, or things like that. Yeah. And this seems increasingly lost in American culture, at least. But when you see groups of people, I mean, even something like, every happy birthday, everyone sings happy birthday, someone in a restaurant, and then everyone joins in, even at other tables, or, America the Beautiful, or, Star Spangled Banner in the United States. But in other cultures, like you said, in Romania and Wales, I've been at dinners in Italy where everyone will start singing. And
this is
extraordinary.
It's phenomenal. I think it's such an important part of being a human being, actually. To have the sense that something binds you together. Georgians have this, Armenians have this. Of course, I'm not naming others only because I'm afraid that then you keep naming and naming and naming. There are so many cultures where this is so important, and when this is absent, I think it's a terrible loss. People feel totally disconnected from each other. I have an extraordinary friend and colleague in Greece who is formerly the concertmaster, now the director of the Thessaloniki State Orchestra, Simos Papanas, who tours internationally with people like Daniel Hope, and he's an extraordinary violinist, but he's also a great patriot of his culture. He knows Greek music inside out, and when I invited him to McGill to give a lecture, he would take his violin and say, "Okay, this is this mode, this is this mode, this is this mode," you know, and to me, this is a gift that you have this richness surrounding you that is part of who you are. And it's sad when this is not really the case with most people. And, and then also, of course, with classical music, most of it came out in some way form from this kind of traditions. Of course, it can be very filtered and remote, but if you don't have a connection to this, it's sometimes very hard to, like, I remember this example that Bernstein always would give when he talked about Mahler, in the first song of the Knaben, the songs of the Wayfarer, Fahrende Geselle, where he would talk about how in the beginning, this change of meter and pace is just like what happens at the Jewish wedding. They strike up the music and then they get tired and then they restart again, that sort of thing. If you have never heard that, it doesn't make sense what's going on in the score.
Sure.
Just, yeah. It has no rationale.
Right. It's just
that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we should probably be wrapping up, but let me just ask you one last question. I'll put a link in. Is there any recording, maybe any of solo piano music or anything else, that one recording that comes to mind is particularly iconic that you would want people to hear from recorded history?
It's hard. There are so many.
No, it's a crazy question.
I can tell you there are, maybe I can name a few and you can choose.
Okay.
For me, most of Rachmaninoff's recorded legacy remains a source of tremendous inspiration, because unlike so many of his colleagues, he understood that he's leaving this for posterity and that it has to be in some way definitive. So what he recorded is what he wanted. So his recording, for example, of Lilacs, his transcription of, or the two Kreisler transcriptions, Liebesleid and Liebesfreude. It's stratospheric playing. It's hard to imagine that it's a human being who could play so perfectly and so movingly at the same time. I'm always awed by Ignaz Friedman's recording of the E-flat Nocturne, Opus 55. I mentioned the Lipati recording of Enescu Third Sonata. I would be very sad if I would never hear again, for instance, some of Courtaulds' performances, even though they're actually far from perfect from a technical point of view, but it can be so amazingly inspiring.
Okay. Well, I think that gives me plenty to get people started on there. So, well, Ilya, I'm really looking forward to playing with you. We'll be doing the Schumann Quintet and the Schnittke Quintet, and I think you're playing a Liszt Ballade also. B minor, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yes.
it's gonna be a great festival this summer.
So terribly looking forward to being there, and many thanks for the invitation. Many thanks for allowing this space to talk about things that are exciting to me. It's in a way a rare opportunity, so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much.
This is great. So thank you.